Fate arrived wrapped in a tragedy on a merciless winter day in 1876, when Florence Blackwood stood over the fresh grave of her husband, numb fingers clutching a wilted wildflower as the Dakota Territory winds howled a mournful dirge across the plains. The frozen earth had been stubborn, refusing to accept Thomas's body until the men of Willow Creek had taken turns with pickaxes for nearly 2 days. Now, as the last of the mourners trudged back toward town, Florence remained rooted beside the crude wooden cross, unable to fathom how she would survive without him. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sheriff Miller approached cautiously, his weathered face creased with concern. "Storm's coming in. Let me take you back to your homestead." Florence nodded, her throat too constricted for words. Thomas had been dead less than a week. Pneumonia, they said, though Florence blamed herself for not recognizing the severity of his cough until it was too late. By then, the doctor could do nothing but shake his head solemnly and prepare her for the inevitable. The ride back to her small homestead passed in a blur. Florence barely registered the sheriff's awkward condolences or his promise to check on her in a few days. When he finally departed, she stood in the doorway of her cabin, listening to the overwhelming silence. The reality of her situation pressed down upon her shoulders. Thomas had been everything: husband, provider, protector. They'd come west with dreams of building a life together, starting a family on their own land. Now Florence was alone with winter settling in, limited supplies, and no idea how to manage the struggling farm they'd established just 18 months earlier. That first night alone, she wept until exhaustion claimed her. The second day, she took inventory of their meager stores, enough flour, beans, and preserved food to last perhaps a month if she was careful. The third day, she attempted to chop wood but succeeded only in blistering her hands and producing a pathetic pile of kindling. By the end of the first week, Florence realized she needed help, but pride kept her from seeking charity. She'd heard too many stories of widows who became burdens on the community, eventually forced to accept marriage proposals from men they barely knew or leave town altogether. As the supplies dwindled, Florence rationed ever more strictly. A spoonful of beans at morning, a slice of hard bread at night. She grew weaker, spending more time in bed to conserve energy. The brutal January winds found every crack in the cabin walls, and she couldn't gather enough wood to keep the fire burning through the night. 2 weeks after the funeral, Florence realized she hadn't eaten in 2 days. She'd been saving the last of the flour for tomorrow, but even that wouldn't sustain her much longer. Desperate, she bundled in every layer she owned and set out toward town, 5 miles away. The journey that had once taken her an hour now demanded every ounce of her diminishing strength. Halfway there, her vision blurred and she stumbled, falling into a snowdrift. She tried to rise but found her limbs uncooperative, her mind clouding. "Madam, madam, can you hear me?" The voice seemed to come from miles away. Florence felt strong arms lifting her and then the rhythmic motion of a horse beneath her. She leaned against something solid and warm, too weak to protest or even open her eyes. "Stay with me now. Ranch is just ahead." She drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of being carried inside somewhere warm, of a spoon at her lips, of gentle hands removing her frozen outer garments. When she finally came fully awake, Florence found herself on a comfortable bed near a roaring fireplace in an unfamiliar room. "You're awake, good." A tall man with broad shoulders stood in the doorway, a steaming mug in his hand. "Thought I might lose you for a while there." Florence struggled to sit up. "Where am I?" "North Star Ranch, my place." He approached slowly, as if afraid of startling her. "Name's Nathan Hayes. Found you half frozen on the trail to town." Florence accepted the mug he offered, broth, rich and savory. Her hands trembled as she brought it to her lips. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes, but I need to get back to my homestead. In your condition." "Begging your pardon, madam, but you're in no state to go anywhere." His voice was deep with a slight drawl, his expression direct but kind. "You're Florence Blackwood, aren't you? Thomas Blackwood's widow?" She nodded, surprised. "Word travels in these parts. I was sorry to hear about your husband." Nathan ran a hand through his dark hair, streaked with early gray at the temples despite his relatively young face. "How long has it been since you've eaten properly?" Florence looked away, embarrassment heating her cheeks. "I've been managing." That wasn't what I asked. His tone remained gentle but firm. A few days, perhaps. She couldn't meet his eyes. The winter's been harder than expected. Nathan nodded thoughtfully. Well, you'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow, if you're stronger, we can talk about getting you home. But first, he gestured toward the door where a young boy of about 12 peered in curiously. My son William is bringing you a proper meal. The boy entered carrying a tray laden with food, venison stew, fresh bread, even a small serving of preserved peaches. Florence's mouth watered at the sight, but she hesitated. Mr. Hayes, I can't accept, share my table, share my life, Nathan said simply. It's an old saying my mother taught me, means no one goes hungry when I have food to offer. Too weak to argue further, Florence accepted the tray. She tried to eat slowly with dignity, but hunger overwhelmed her manners. Easy, Nathan cautioned. Your stomach needs time to remember its purpose. For 3 days, Florence remained at North Star Ranch, regaining her strength under the watchful eyes of Nathan and his son. She learned that Nathan had been widowed himself 5 years earlier when William was just 7. His wife had died in childbirth along with their second child, leaving him to raise their son alone. Unlike Florence's struggling homestead, Nathan's ranch was prosperous 2,000 acres with a herd of cattle, several good horses, and a comfortable 2-story house he'd built himself. He employed 3 ranch hands who lived in a bunkhouse nearby. On the 3rd morning, Florence announced her intention to return home. I'm grateful for your hospitality, Mr. Hayes, but I've imposed long enough. Nathan studied her across the breakfast table. And what will you do when you get there? Pardon my bluntness, madam, but you were starving when I found you, Florence stiffened. I'll manage. How, winter's only half done. Do you have supplies, money to buy them? She looked down at her hands. I'll find work in town, in Willow Creek, in winter. Nathan shook his head. Mrs. Blackwood, I don't mean to be unkind, but there's barely enough work for the folks already there. Florence felt tears threatening and blinked them back furiously. What would you have me do, Mr. Hayes? Abandon my home, my husband's dream? Nathan's expression softened. No, madam. But I'm offering you a choice. Stay here through winter, at least. I've got plenty of room, and William seems to enjoy having company. He nodded toward his son, who was showing Florence how to play checkers by the fire. Come spring, you'll be stronger and we can figure out what's best for your place. And in exchange, Florence asked warily. She'd heard stories about vulnerable widows. Nathan's eyes reflected surprise, then understanding. In exchange, you help with the cooking and household tasks if you're so inclined. My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, comes only 3 days a week, and William and I manage poorly between her visits. He stood, adjusting his suspenders. That's all, Mrs. Blackwood. You have my word as a gentleman. Something in his steady gaze convinced her he was sincere. Very well, Mr. Hayes, until spring. The arrangement began awkwardly. Florence felt like an intruder in the well-ordered household, constantly aware she was accepting charity. Nathan seemed equally uncomfortable having a lady in his home permanently, often working longer hours with his cattle to avoid too much interaction. William, however, took to Florence immediately. The boy had grown up without a mother's influence, and Florence found purpose in mending his clothes, helping with his reading lessons, and ensuring he ate vegetables with dinner. She began to look forward to their evenings by the fire, when William would pepper her with questions about her life before coming west. Did you live in a big city? Did you have servants? Could you see the ocean from your window? His curiosity was boundless. I grew up in Boston, she told him one evening while Nathan sat quietly in his chair, pretending to read but clearly listening. My father was a bookkeeper. We lived modestly but comfortably. And yes, sometimes on Sundays we would take the streetcar to the harbor and I could see the ocean stretching beyond the horizon. Why'd you come west then? William asked, eyes wide, Florence's hands stilled in her lap. I met Thomas at a church social. He had such dreams, such conviction. He'd been west once before and couldn't stop talking about the land, the freedom, the future out here. She smiled sadly. He painted such a picture that I found myself dreaming of it too. Do you regret it? The question came not from William but from Nathan, who had set his book aside. Florence considered carefully. No, she said finally. Even knowing how it would end, I wouldn't change my choice. Thomas was. She swallowed hard. He was worth following even here. Nathan nodded, something like respect in his eyes. As January gave way to February, Florence found herself establishing a routine. She rose early to prepare breakfast, spent mornings managing household tasks, afternoons teaching William or helping with indoor projects, and evenings in quiet companionship by the fire. She began to notice small details about Nathan, how he always removed his hat and boots before entering the house, no matter how tired, how his voice softened when speaking to his horses, how his rare smile transformed his serious face. Nathan, too, observed Florence when she wasn't looking, her determination to contribute despite being a guest, her patience with William, the quiet strength that had allowed her to survive against impossible odds. He found himself riding home earlier each day, looking forward to evenings in the warm kitchen where Florence's presence had somehow made his house feel more like a home than it had in years. One evening in mid-February, a blizzard howled around the ranch house. The ranch hands had been sent to the safety of the bunkhouse after securing the livestock, and Nathan had just returned from a final check of the barn. "All's well?" Florence asked, handing him a cup of coffee as he stomped snow from his boots. "Animals are settled." "It's going to be a bad one, though." He accepted the cup gratefully, their fingers brushing momentarily. "Where's William?" "Asleep." The excitement of the storm wore him out. She smiled, and Nathan realized how rarely she had smiled when she first arrived. The change made something twist pleasantly in his chest. They sat by the fire, listening to the wind. For once, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than strained. "I've been meaning to ask," Nathan said finally. "What will you do come spring? About your homestead?" Florence sighed. "In truth, I don't know. Thomas and I were struggling even before he fell ill. The land is rocky, not ideal for farming. We hadn't the capital to invest in livestock." She twisted her wedding ring. "I suppose I could try to sell it, but who would buy such a difficult piece of land? I might." The words left Nathan's mouth before he'd fully considered them. Florence looked up sharply. "You? It borders my northern pasture, doesn't it? I've been wanting to expand in that direction." He set his coffee down. "I'd pay fair market value, enough for you to make a fresh start somewhere else." "That's very generous. It's not charity if that's what you're thinking. It's a business decision." Nathan leaned forward. "But it does raise the question of where you'd go." Florence looked into the fire. "I have a cousin in St. Louis. She's offered me a place before. Is that what you want?" "To go back east?" The question hung between them, heavier than it should have been. Florence realized with sudden clarity that the thought of leaving North Star Ranch, leaving Nathan and William, filled her with unexpected sadness. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "I came west to build a life, not to retreat." Nathan nodded, and they lapsed into silence again, each lost in private thoughts as the storm raged outside. The next morning, Florence woke to find the world transformed. Snow had drifted against the house, covering the first-floor windows entirely. Nathan and the ranch hands spent the day digging paths to the barn and bunkhouse, while Florence prepared extra food for the men working in the bitter cold. That evening, exhausted from fighting the snow, Nathan came inside to find Florence teaching William to bake bread. "You've got flour on your nose, son," he said, smiling at the domestic scene before him. William grinned, unembarrassed. "Florence says making bread is like magic. You mix simple things together and they become something completely different and better." "Is that so?" Nathan's eyes met Florence's over his son's head. "More or less," she replied, color rising in her cheeks. "Though I believe I said it was like a small miracle, not magic." "Miracles are in short supply out here," Nathan said, washing his hands at the basin, "but I'll take what I can get." Later, after William had gone to bed, Nathan found Florence in the sitting room, darning one of his socks by lamplight. "You don't need to do that," he said, slightly embarrassed. "I don't mind. It's the least I can do, considering your generosity." Nathan sat across from her. "About that?" "I've been thinking about your homestead." Florence set her mending aside. "Yes. What if you didn't sell it outright? What if we arranged a partnership of sorts?" "A partnership?" She looked confused. "I don't understand." "I could invest in improving the land, better soil management, maybe some cattle. You'd maintain ownership and we'd split any profits." He spoke carefully, watching her reaction. You could stay on here until it becomes profitable enough to rebuild your cabin properly. Florence studied him. That's an unusual proposition, Mr. Hayes. Nathan, he corrected gently. After all this time, I think you might call me Nathan. Nathan, she repeated, the name feeling strange and yet right on her tongue. Why would you make such an offer? He hesitated. William has grown attached to you. And you've brought something to this house that's been missing for a long time. And is that all? Florence surprised herself with her boldness. Nathan's eyes darkened. No, he admitted quietly, that's not all. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Nathan stood abruptly. Forgive me, I've overstepped. You haven't, Florence said quickly. I need time to consider your proposal. It's very generous. Take all the time you need. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Florence, I think you belong out here. Not back east. After he left, Florence sat motionless, her heart beating rapidly. She was a widow of barely 2 months. It was too soon to consider. What Nathan hadn't proposed marriage, only a business arrangement. And yet, something in his eyes when he looked at her suggested he might want more eventually. Did she? The question haunted her as February turned to March, and the snow began its slow retreat. Florence found herself watching Nathan more closely, the strength in his hands as he worked with the horses, the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to William, the quiet authority he commanded among his men. Thomas had been different, younger, more impulsive, full of grand dreams and sweeping gestures. She had loved him deeply. But Nathan was steadfast, reliable, a man whose word was his bond, a man who had saved her life and asked nothing in return. One evening in early March, Florence was preparing dinner when she heard a commotion outside. Through the window, she saw Nathan dismounting quickly, helping one of his ranch hands down from another horse. The young man, barely more than a boy, really was clutching his arm, his face pale with pain. William, fetch hot water and clean cloths, Nathan called as he entered, supporting the young cowboy. Florence, do you know anything about setting bones? Florence nodded, already rolling up her sleeves. My father broke his arm when I was 15. I helped the doctor. Together, they worked over the ranch hand. Joey was his name. She learned who had been thrown from his horse while checking fence lines. His forearm had snapped cleanly, and while Nathan held him steady, Florence carefully aligned the bone and splinted it. You've got steady hands, Nathan remarked afterward as they washed up in the kitchen. And a cool head. Necessity teaches many skills, she replied. He'll need a proper doctor when the road's clear. Doc Wilson comes through every month or so, should be here within the week. Nathan dried his hands, studying her. You continue to surprise me, Florence Blackwood, she smiled. Is that a compliment? Absolutely. His eyes held hers a moment longer than necessary. I've been meaning to talk to you about something. Would you walk with me tomorrow? There's a place I'd like to show you. The next afternoon, Nathan saddled 2 horses and led Florence east across his property. The day was unusually warm for March, the snow melting in patches to reveal the first hints of green beneath. They rode for nearly an hour, cresting a gentle hill that overlooked a sweeping valley. This is the view I wanted you to see, Nathan said, dismounting and helping Florence down. What do you think? Florence caught her breath. The landscape stretched before them, rolling hills, a winding creek, cottonwood trees just beginning to bud along its banks. It's beautiful, she said honestly. This is where your land meets mine. He pointed to an invisible boundary line. Together they make something special, don't you think? Florence understood he wasn't just talking about the land. Yes, she said softly, I believe they do. Nathan turned to face her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. Florence, I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving Thomas. But I want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'd like to court you properly. Florence felt her heart flutter in her chest. Nathan, you don't need to answer now, he said quickly. Just know that my offer about the land stands regardless. It's good business. But my feelings for you have nothing to do with business. She studied his face, the strong line of his jaw, the tiny crinkles at the corners of his eyes, the sincerity in his gaze. Thank you for your honesty, she said finally, and for giving me time. They rode back mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with possibility rather than awkwardness. That night, Florence lay awake long after the household had gone quiet. She thought of Thomas, his dreams, his laughter, his stubborn optimism even when their situation grew dire. She would always love him, but she also thought of Nathan, so different and yet equally worthy of admiration. Of William, who needed a mother's guidance. Of the land that had nearly killed her but still called to something deep in her soul. "What would you want from me, Thomas?" She whispered into the darkness, almost expecting an answer. The next morning, Florence woke with a sense of clarity. She found Nathan in the barn, checking a mare that was close to foaling. "Good morning," she said, pulling her shawl tighter against the early chill. He straightened, surprised to see her there. "Florence, is everything all right?" "Yes," she took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about your proposal, both proposals, actually." Nathan wiped his hands on a rag, giving her his full attention. "And I'd like to accept the business arrangement." "My land combined with your expertise makes good sense." She met his eyes steadily. "As for the other matter, yes." His voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "I think I would like to be courted, Nathan Hayes." She smiled slightly. "When the time is right." The relief and joy that spread across his face warmed her more than any fire could have. "And when might that time be?" Florence considered. "I think perhaps after the spring roundup. That would be 3 months since Thomas, it feels respectful." Nathan nodded. "The roundup it is then." He hesitated, then reached out slowly to take her hand, squeezing it gently before releasing it. "Thank you for staying, Florence." "Thank you for finding me that day," she replied softly, "for saying those words. Share my table, share my life," he smiled. "Best invitation I ever extended." The weeks leading up to the spring roundup passed in a flurry of activity. As the weather warmed, Florence insisted on visiting her homestead, accompanied by Nathan. The small cabin stood forlorn and weathered, but intact. Inside, everything remained as she had left it, Thomas's clothing still hanging from pegs, their few books stacked neatly on a shelf, the bed covered with a quilt she had made during their first winter together. "We should bring your things back to the ranch," Nathan said gently. "Whatever you want to keep," Florence nodded, running her fingers over Thomas's favorite chair. "Yes, but some things can stay, for now." They loaded her personal items into Nathan's wagon, clothing, keepsakes, her mother's china teacup that had somehow survived the journey west. As they prepared to leave, Florence stood in the doorway, looking back at the small space that represented so much hope and heartbreak. "We'll make something of this land, Florence," Nathan promised, standing respectfully behind her. "For Thomas's memory, if nothing else." She turned to him with tear-filled eyes. "Thank you for understanding." Back at North Star Ranch, life settled into a new rhythm. Florence no longer felt like a guest, but a necessary part of the household. She expanded the kitchen garden, took over most of William's schooling, and even learned to ride properly under Nathan's patient instruction. Nathan, true to his word, maintained a respectful distance while finding small ways to show his growing affection, bringing her wildflowers he found while riding the range, carving a new rolling pin when the old one broke, sitting beside her at dinner rather than at the opposite end of the table. William, observant despite his youth, noticed the changing dynamic between the adults. "Are you going to marry Florence?" he asked his father bluntly one evening while Florence was outside gathering eggs. Nathan nearly choked on his coffee. "That's a mighty personal question, son." "Well, are you?" William persisted. "Because I think you should. She makes the best biscuits and she doesn't get mad when I track mud in, and she knows all kinds of stories." "Those are fine qualities in a wife," Nathan agreed, fighting a smile. "But marriage is complicated, William." "Florence needs time," the boy considered this. "Because she still misses her husband?" "Yes, and because deciding to marry someone is one of the biggest decisions a person can make." William nodded solemnly. "I'd vote yes if I got a vote." "I'll keep that in mind," Nathan promised, ruffling his son's hair. April brought the spring roundup, a week of hard work as Nathan and his men gathered cattle that had scattered across the winter range, branding new calves and preparing some for the drive to market. Florence kept the home fires burning, literally and figuratively, preparing massive meals for the exhausted cowboys and tending to minor injuries. On the final evening of the roundup, the ranch hands celebrated with music and storytelling around a bonfire. Florence watched from the porch as Nathan played his harmonica, his face relaxed and younger looking in the firelight. When he caught her watching, he tipped his hat with a smile that made her heart race. Later, after the men had retired to the bunkhouse and William to his bed, Nathan joined Florence on the porch. They sat side by side in rocking chairs, watching the stars emerge above the distant mountains. "Roundup's over," Nathan said quietly, "so it is." "Does that mean I can begin courting you properly, Florence Blackwood?" She turned to him, feeling strangely shy despite the months of living under his roof. "I believe it does, Nathan Hayes." He reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. "I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures, but I want you to know that I admire you more than any woman I've ever known. Your courage, your kindness, your determination." Florence squeezed his hand. "I've come to care for you deeply, Nathan, more than I thought possible after Thomas." "I know I'm not him," Nathan said carefully. "I wouldn't want to replace what you had." "No," she agreed. "What I had with Thomas was unique, but what's growing between us is equally special, just different." Nathan stood, still holding her hand, and drew her gently to her feet. In the silver moonlight, his expression was tender and questioning. "May I kiss you, Florence?" Instead of answering, she rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips softly to his. Nathan's arms came around her carefully, as if she might break, and then more firmly as she responded. When they finally parted, both were breathing unevenly. "Well," Nathan said, a hint of wonder in his voice. "That was worth waiting for." Florence laughed quietly, resting her forehead against his chest. "Indeed it was." The courtship that followed was both conventional and unique. Conventional in that Nathan called on Florence formally, even though they lived in the same house, bringing her flowers, taking her for buggy rides on Sunday afternoons, sitting with her on the porch swing in the evenings. Unique because they already shared the intimacy of a household, knew each other's habits and preferences, had formed a family unit of sorts with William long before acknowledging their romantic feelings. In late May, Nathan took Florence to town for the spring social. It was her first public appearance since Thomas's funeral, and she felt the curious eyes of the townsfolk following them as they entered the decorated schoolhouse. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sheriff Miller approached, tipping his hat. "Good to see you looking so well. We were all mighty worried about you this winter." "Mr. Hayes was kind enough to offer me employment and lodging," Florence explained, conscious of maintaining her reputation. "So I heard." The sheriff's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Lucky coincidence, him finding you that day." "Providence, not coincidence," Nathan corrected, placing a protective hand at the small of Florence's back. "If you'll excuse us, Sheriff, I believe this dance is promised to me." As Nathan led her to the dance floor, Florence whispered, "They're all watching us and whispering." "Let them," he said calmly. "We've done nothing wrong, and soon enough they'll have something else to gossip about." The music began a waltz, thankfully, which Florence knew well. Nathan proved to be a surprisingly graceful dancer for a man who spent most of his life on horseback. As he guided her around the floor, Florence gradually relaxed, enjoying the sensation of being in his arms publicly. "You dance beautifully," she told him. "My mother insisted I learn, said no woman wants a husband who steps on her toes." His eyes held a question. "Speaking of husbands." Florence's heart skipped. "Yes, not here," he murmured. "Later." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of dancing, conversation, and punch that was scandalously spiked by one of the older ranchers. By the time they climbed into Nathan's buggy for the ride home, Florence's cheeks were flushed with excitement and the mild effects of the punch. Instead of taking the direct route home, Nathan turned the horses toward the creek that ran through his property. The night was warm, the air fragrant with spring blossoms, and a full moon illuminated the landscape in silver light. "Where are we going?" Florence asked. "I want to show you something." He stopped the buggy near a grove of cottonwoods and helped her down. Taking her hand, he led her along a narrow path to a small clearing overlooking the creek. There, to Florence's surprise, stood a half-built structure, the beginnings of a cabin, larger and more substantial than her old homestead. "Nathan, what is this?" He guided her closer. "It's for your land, our business partnership. I've been working on it with the men during evenings." It's not finished, but I wanted you to see it. Florence walked around the foundation, noting the quality of the work, the generous dimensions. It's much bigger than my old cabin. It's designed for a family, Nathan said quietly. Should the owner ever want one? She turned to face him, understanding dawning. Nathan. He took both her hands in his. Florence Blackwood, I've loved you since the moment you sat at my table and tried so hard to maintain your dignity while you were starving. His voice roughened with emotion. I love your strength, your gentleness with William, your determination to make something of yourself out here despite everything. Florence felt tears welling in her eyes. Nathan, let me finish, please. He took a deep breath. I know it's been only 4 months since Thomas passed. If you need more time, I'll wait, but I want you to know that I wish to make you my wife, to raise William together, perhaps have more children if God wills it. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a simple gold band. This was my mother's. Would you do me the honor of wearing it as my wife? Florence looked at the ring, then up at Nathan's face, earnest, vulnerable, beloved. In that moment, she knew with certainty what her answer must be. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Nathan, I will marry you. His face broke into a smile of such joy that it took her breath away. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace that made her laugh out loud. When he set her down, she placed a hand on his cheek. I need you to know something. I will always hold Thomas in my heart. As you should, Nathan said simply. Just as I'll always remember Rebecca, but I believe there's room in a heart for more than one love. Florence stretched up to kiss him, pouring all her complicated feelings into the embrace, gratitude for his understanding, joy in their future, and the deep, steadfast love that had grown between them through hardship and kindness. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, attended by Nathan's hands, a few neighbors, and the circuit riding preacher who happened to be passing through. William stood proudly at his father's side, beaming as Florence became his stepmother officially. That evening, after the modest celebration had ended, and William had been tucked into bed with promises that nothing would change except for Florence moving into his father's room, the newlyweds stood on the porch of what was now truly their home. Happy, Mrs. Hayes? Nathan asked, his arm around her waist. Very happy, Mr. Hayes. She leaned against him, comfortable in his strength. Though I must admit, I'm nervous about tomorrow. He understood her meaning without elaboration. We have all the time in the world, Florence. Nothing needs to happen until you're ready. She turned in his arms, looking up at him with trust and love. I am ready, just be patient with me. Always, he promised, leading her inside to begin their life together. Their first night as husband and wife was tender, sometimes awkward, but ultimately beautiful in its honesty. Nathan's patience and Florence's trust combined to forge a physical bond as meaningful as their emotional one. Afterward, lying in his arms, Florence felt a sense of rightness, of having found her place in the world again. Summer brought prosperity to North Star Ranch. The cattle thrived, the new cabin on Florence's original homestead neared completion, and the partnership Nathan had proposed proved profitable indeed. Florence's land, when properly managed with Nathan's experience and resources, yielded better than anyone expected. You should be proud, Nathan told her one evening as they reviewed the ledgers together. Your land is paying its own way now. Our land, she corrected, smiling, just as this is our home. William thrived under Florence's care, growing inches that summer and developing a newfound interest in books thanks to her encouragement. He took to calling her mother within weeks of the wedding, the name coming naturally to his lips one morning at breakfast and bringing happy tears to Florence's eyes. In August, Florence confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks: she was expecting a child. When she told Nathan, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He lifted her gently, spinning her around the kitchen before setting her down and kissing her with reverent joy. A baby, he kept saying, his hand resting wonderingly on her still flat stomach. Our baby. William was equally excited when they told him he would be a big brother. Will it be a boy or a girl? He demanded to know. That's for God to decide, Florence told him, laughing at his impatience. I hope it's both, he declared. A brother and a sister, can we have that? Nathan chuckled. One at a time, son. One at a time. As Florence's pregnancy progressed, Nathan grew increasingly protective, insisting she rest more and hiring additional help for the household chores. Florence protested that she wasn't an invalid but secretly appreciated his concern. In late September, they hosted a harvest celebration at the ranch, inviting neighbors from miles around. Standing beside Nathan as they welcomed their guests, Florence marveled at how different her life was from the desperate widow who had collapsed in the snow just 8 months earlier. "You're glowing," Nathan whispered, his hand at the small of her back. "I'm happy," she replied simply. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again." The festivities lasted well into the night, with dancing in the barn, a feast that showcased Florence's cooking skills, and enough goodwill to carry the community through the coming winter. As the last guests departed, Florence stood with Nathan and William on the porch, waving goodbye. "Can we do this every year?" William asked sleepily. Nathan exchanged a look with Florence. "I believe we can, son. It's good to create family traditions." Family, the word wrapped around Florence's heart like a warm blanket. She had lost one family and found another, built something new from the ashes of tragedy. As the baby quickened within her, she placed a hand on her growing belly, feeling a kick against her palm. "She's lively tonight," Nathan said, placing his hand beside hers. You think it's a girl." He smiled. "Just a feeling, would you mind?" "Not at all." Florence leaned against him. "A daughter would be wonderful, a son would be equally so." The winter of 1876-1877 proved milder than the previous one, for which Florence was grateful as her pregnancy advanced. Christmas was celebrated with simple gifts and elaborate baking, William's excitement infectious as he helped decorate the house with pine boughs and red ribbons. On Christmas morning, Nathan presented Florence with a specially commissioned cradle, handcrafted by a carpenter in town from the wood of a cherry tree that had grown on North Star Ranch. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Our child will sleep soundly here." "The first of many, I hope," Nathan said, his eyes warm with love. Florence kissed him, ignoring William's theatrical groan of disgust. "Many sounds perfect." In February, as the first hints of spring began to appear, Florence went into labor. Nathan sent one of the ranch hands galloping for the midwife in town while he paced anxiously outside the bedroom door. William sat on the stairs, wide-eyed and worried. "Is Mother going to be all right?" he asked his father. Nathan paused in his pacing to sit beside his son. "Your mother is the strongest woman I know," he said firmly. "And Mrs. Peterson is the best midwife in the territory. They'll both be fine." After 12 hours of labor, as the sun began to set, Florence gave birth to a healthy daughter with a shock of dark hair and lungs that announced her arrival to the entire household. When Nathan was finally allowed into the room, he found Florence propped up against the pillows, tired but radiant, their daughter cradled in her arms. "She's perfect," he whispered, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed and touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "Just like her mother." Florence smiled up at him. "I thought we might name her Hope. It seems fitting." "Hope Hayes." Nathan tested the name and nodded. "It's perfect." William was permitted a brief visit, his initial disappointment at not getting a brother quickly forgotten when Hope wrapped her tiny fingers around his much larger one. "She likes me," he said, awestruck. "Of course she does," Florence assured him. "You're her big brother. She'll always look up to you." As spring returned to the Dakota Territory, life at North Star Ranch settled into a new rhythm centered around baby Hope. Florence recovered quickly from the birth, soon resuming her role as the heart of the household while adapting to the demands of a newborn. Nathan proved to be a devoted father, often carrying Hope in one arm while he conducted ranch business, much to the amusement of his hands. On a warm day in late April, Nathan saddled 2 horses and asked Florence to ride with him. Mrs. Peterson had come to watch Hope and William, assuring Florence that a few hours away would do her good. "Where are we going?" Florence asked as they rode eastward. "You'll see." They crested the same hill where Nathan had first spoken of his feelings for her a year earlier. The view was even more beautiful now, spring greenery covering the rolling landscape. wildflowers dotting the meadows, the creek running full with snowmelt. But what caught Florence's eye was the cabin completed now, with smoke rising from the chimney and a small kitchen garden already planted beside it. "It's finished," she said, surprised. Nathan nodded. "I had the men working on it through winter whenever weather permitted. It's fully furnished and stocked. But why the rush? We've no tenant yet." "I thought perhaps—" Nathan hesitated. "I thought perhaps we might use it ourselves from time to time as a second home, a place to remember where we started and to appreciate how far we've come." Florence understood then. He had built this not just as an investment or a business decision, but as a gift to her, a way to honor Thomas's memory while embracing their future together. "I would like that very much," she said softly. They dismounted and approached the cabin together. Inside, Florence found a harmonious blend of old and new furniture from her original homestead, some newly crafted pieces, all arranged with care and thought. On the mantel above the fireplace sat two framed photographs, one of Thomas that she had brought from her old cabin, and one of Nathan's late wife, Rebecca. Beside them stood a recent portrait of their blended family: Nathan, Florence, William, and baby Hope. "Is this all right?" Nathan asked, watching her face carefully. "Having them here with us," Florence felt tears spring to her eyes. "It's more than all right, it's perfect." She turned to her husband, this man who had saved her life in more ways than one, who had opened his home and heart, who understood that love wasn't diminished by honoring what came before. "Share my table, share my life," she quoted back to him, her voice thick with emotion. "You offered me food when I was starving, Nathan Hayes, but you gave me so much more. You gave me a future when I thought mine had ended." Nathan gathered her into his arms, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "You gave me just as much, Florence, a second chance at happiness, a mother for my son. Hope in every sense of the word." As they stood together in the cabin that represented both past and future, Florence reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the grief that had nearly destroyed her, the kindness that had saved her, and the love that had healed her. "I believe," she said thoughtfully, "that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as our darkest moments. Like finding a half-frozen widow on the trail," Nathan suggested with a smile. "Exactly like that." She stretched up to kiss him. "Take me home, Nathan, to our family." They rode back to North Star Ranch side by side, partners in every sense, their shared love a testament to the resilience of the human heart and the endless capacity for new beginnings, even in the wild, unforgiving landscape of the American West. As they approached the ranch house, Florence could see William on the porch, waving excitedly, baby Hope in Mrs. Peterson's arms beside him. The sight filled her with a contentment so complete it nearly overwhelmed her. "Look," she said to Nathan, pointing. "Everything that matters right there waiting for us." Nathan reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. "And to think it all began with 7 simple words. Share my table, share my life," Florence repeated softly, "the most important invitation I ever accepted." Together, they rode toward home and the future they would build, a future founded on loss but flourishing in love, stronger for having weathered the storm.